afternoon, everyone. It is 4 p.m. now, so we will start in order to manage the time efficiently. Welcome to Sacred Text and Human Context Conferences, Session 8, Panel 1, titled Mystical Traditions and Environment. I am Devparna. I am an assistant professor of sociology at Nazareth College, and I have the honor and privilege of moderating this session. We have three presenters today. I am still waiting for the third presenter, Etin, to show up. But our first two presenters, Dr. Elizabeth Adams-Eilers and Dr. Saundra Sterling Epstein, are with us. Did I pronounce your names correctly, Elizabeth and Saundra? Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So each presenter will get between 18 to 20 minutes. We'll have the three presentations first, and then we will have 30 minutes or so for the question and answer session. Please mute yourselves during the entire presentation sessions, and then you can unmute yourself during the question and answer session. And you can put your questions in the chat, or you can put your, you can just ask your questions. Okay, let's start off with the first presentation. The first presentation is by Dr. Elizabeth Adams-Eilers of Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The title of her paper is On Bonaventure's Mind's Road to God and the Rasā'il of the Ikhwān al-Ṣafā, Tracing Mystical Pathways Towards Union with God and Healing the Earth. So please begin, Elizabeth.
I've changed the title a bit to add a comparative study of excerpts from their book of the creatures rather than trying to attend to their entire works in this case. And my key words are as follows: mystical union, interreligious understanding, intellectual humility, creaturely kinship, animal rights, comparative method in the study of religious texts, narrative discourse, story, narratology, or the study of the dynamic relationship between texts and readers, microcosm and macrocosm. And so as I read the text, you'll hear these terms emerging and hopefully defined within the text. Introduction. Muslims, Sufis, Jewish Kabbalists, Christians, and others striving for unity with the One may experience incomparable peace, healing, and deeper understanding of self and other animal beings. Such religious experiences may also serve as a topic for interreligious dialogue, as participants share accounts of the journey and the life changes it affects along the way. After having experienced a vision of all creation moving joyfully in massive procession towards the one mystic understands that she has encountered a mystery that words could never convey. After some time passes, she may feel God's perceived absence even more concretely than she did before the event. However, the memory of the grand procession is still hers to treasure and re-experience, and creation's daily renewal intimates God's presence in all things. Slowly, the experience saturates the mystic's consciousness, such that feelings of compassion and kinship with all creatures turns into a conviction of truth. This paper explores how two classical studies of the books of the creatures, one Muslim and one Christian, could be said to encourage human recognition of kinship with other creatures as a necessary, good, and true element of the path toward union with God. As I study these texts side by side and move back and forth from one to the other, I am alert to the possibilities of cross-pollinations of ideas, interpretive innovation, and creativity. Francis Clooney, S.J., in Reading Religiously Across Religious Borders, a method for comparative study, notes this distinguishing factor at work in the comparative method of texts. Clooney reminds his readers that religious texts ought not to be reduced to one another to make a point, a tendency always lurking for scholars. This tendency to reduce texts to one another and not to thus honor difference is a pitfall for scholars who are eager to only compare likenesses. Close reading of texts across religious borders includes honoring their multiple layers of meaning, especially when these texts ask readers to interpret them that way, as do these two works. literally, figuratively, morally, scripturally, spiritually. Through interpreting layers of meaning in text, one is more apt to detect differences among comparison of texts. For me, reading these authors' works is a contemplative practice. It begins with wonder, inquiry, and prayer, and that ends with encouragement and hope and celebration of difference and diversity. The aspect of a vulnerable self standing before the unquieting face of difference is sometimes so challenging that it is a road not taken. Courage may be called as a service to textual truths. First, I introduce the Ikhwān Ṣafā, the Brethren of Purity, or the Sincere Brethren, to place their work in historical context. In the 10th century Common Era, the Brethren wrote all 52 epistles from their home bases, the bustling cultural and intellectual centers of Basra and Baghdad, Iraq. Their aim for writing was to teach seekers exploring entrance into their brotherhood. Note that they claim Basra, Iraq as home, and one wonders whether the memory of the saintly Rabia is still palpable. If so, do the Brethren's patriarchal society in this regard, are they no different from most other societies, I wonder? Could the Brethren have extended hospitality to women as audiences? It's just a question. A master of theology and philosophy at the University of Paris, and later selected as minister general of about 300,000 friars of the Franciscan order, Bonaventure of Bagnoregio, the Mind's Road into God in Paris in about the year 1259 CE, teaches Franciscan students in attendance at the university setting. They prepare to become preachers, priests, confessors, and professors about prayer and religious experience. The largest portion of this mystical treatise is dedicated to the study of the books of the creatures, chapters 1 and 2. Like the Brethren, Bonaventure's cosmological vision is that of emanation. All reality emanates from the source and returns to the source. But Bonaventure adds exemplarism as part of the journey. Christ is the exemplar who illuminates, who pulls us out of darkness as we return to God. Reading books of creation and scripture and reading one's own soul are sources for viaticum on the way, and prayer spiritually connects us to this food for the journey and to God throughout the entire journey. In the Mind's Road, while Bonaventure describes aspects of prayer and contemplation in a mystical treatise that hopefully transmits useful knowledge, he reminds friars that their primary aim in life is union with God and not book learning. Finally, it is the experience of the divine in prayer that teaches the heart the best. He hopes his work may stoke students' desires to commit to a life of prayer and thus to enlarge their hearts on the journey to God. But also, ironically, the very philosophical and theological excellence of the Mind's Road demonstrates the intellectual acuity of the author, his intellectual pursuit of knowledge. This reading experience may detect Bonaventure's struggle between the heart and the intellect in his work. I hope to demonstrate how excerpts from these authors' narrative discourses in these two classics could be said to transform readers, to prompt them to envision peace as kinship with other creatures of God as well as themselves. These authors still witness to us hundreds of years later, when this vision is much needed to guide us towards healing the earth. The following list then summarizes my goals for writing. 1, to investigate how a belief in the vision of creaturely kinship can be said to inform the mystical journey toward union with God. 2, to reflect on descriptions of mystical pathways that could generate conversations across religious boundaries, leading to interreligious understandings of the structures of belief. 3, to illustrate how the comparative study of religious texts works interreligiously as the theological method. So first we launch into reading of the epistles of the Brethren of Purity. In the case of the animals versus man before the king of the jinn. If the microcosm macrocosm motif indicates that each human soul is an entire world in little, the Brethren's fable, the case of the animals, suggests that a particular gathering of creatures in the court of the king of the jinn in some fictional but real world represents the entire universe in little. The author deposits readers, audiences, and characters into a moment of narrative time. in which the king of the jinn and his jinni court sages listen to complaints from non-human creatures about humanity's cruelty, arrogance, and thoughtless treatment. Through giving animals the power of speech, the brethren portray animals, creatures' self-disclosure of their goodness, their unselfishness, and unselfishness is sometimes being a little cantankerous, their godliness, and their heroic lives. Yet the narrator of the story depicts all beings, spirit beings called jinni, non-human and human creatures, as being intimately connected to one another in this little narrative world of courtroom and island. As the courtroom drama continues, all characters move through the plot together in procession, and we readers with them as we trace their footsteps of the unfolding story into ultimate mystery. The kingship of all creatures is obvious to readers, if not to the story's human characters moving forward in narrative time. The brethren issue a flattering and open invitation for readers to join the procession of characters moving towards the story's conclusion, for this story is meant for those who are, quote, pure-hearted and clear-headed, and who can weigh evidence, that is, presumably us. The brethren want all of us, characters and readers, to remember that everything that exists springs from a, quote, single cause and single source, just as numbers issue from unity, which is prior to duality, close quotes. While the authors do not directly depict God as the character in the plot, God's absence is present. We see intimations of this presence, though, through the king of the jinn's speeches and through those of his counselors. Furthermore, the animals' speeches point to God's providence as the animals indict human feelings and compare them to their own blessed lives, their own lives of ascetic holiness. At the story's conclusion, again, God's presence is intimated as all stand in awe, wonder, and silence upon viewing the aspect of a human saint. By this conclusion, a strange reversal in plot has taken place, even given the weight of the evidence against humanity. In the end, the brethren want all to see, readers of the text and the characters alike, that the saint is the highest thing that God has created, and other human beings win the case, because saints are human beings. We have all moved in procession to this conclusion to view the possibility and even the reality of an ultimately perfect human being. On the appearance of this figure, the courtroom scene dissolves into a peaceful environment with a tone of awe and wonder permeating the story's language. No more debate, no more complaint. The heretofore perhaps puzzled reader remains puzzled and gives up expectations. How to reconcile this ending with the author's obvious empathy with the animal's plight as exposed by textual language. How to excuse a question of human cruelty and dominance over other creatures. Why does the king, the judge, and the courtroom scene never announce a verdict? The brethren ask readers to explore a conundrum and cipher multiple levels of meaning. Multiples of symbolic meaning are depicted in the opening scenes of a court session that depicts the king of the jinn and his sage counselor as overwhelmed with awe upon contemplating the diversity of life represented in court. Note that in the following passage, the king and his court philosopher exhibit not only awe and wonder, but also praise, devotion, gratitude, and humility, all important aspects of prayer that accompany pilgrims on a mystical journey. The scene suggests the beginning of a mystical journey towards God in prayer, and it also implies the kinship of all creatures created by God. The king gazed left and right, beholding the immense diversity of shapes and forms, colors, sounds, and songs before him. For some time he was overcome with wonder. Then turning to one of the wise jinni philosophers, he said, "Look at those marvelous creatures, handiwork of the All-Merciful." "I see them, Your Majesty," came the reply. "I see them with the eyes of my head, but in my heart I behold their Creator. Your Majesty is amazed at them, and I am amazed at the wisdom of the Creator who formed and fashioned them, who raised and reared them, who gave them being and preserves and provides for them still, who knows their every lair and refuge." All this writ plain in his book with nothing left out or forgotten, but each detail clear and precise. The jinn spirit beings appreciate and honor the lives of all creatures here collected in this courtroom setting, but human beings do not. Non-human creatures fight for their honor, human claims of superiority because humans live in magnificent houses and clothe themselves with beautiful materials. The bee responds that they live in hexagonal cells and work hard to feed themselves and others, noting that it is their kinship with other bees that bring them success in their communal ventures. The nightingale responds to humanity's boast that befitting their superior status, humanity gathers an excess of fine foods and delicious drinks, with the observation that human beings gather such excess by the toil of their bodies that degrades the soul, reckoning, trading, coming and going on distant journeys in search of their wants and needs, hoarding and grossing, while suffering all the austerities of a niggardly miser. These humans suffer results of bad actions and unwholesome choices, they say, that ruin their bodies and souls and bring untimely death, grief, and mourning. We birds, however, the nightingale continues, are removed from all this. We leave what we don't need. We gain nutriment that springs up for us from the ground at the rain from the sky. We do not trouble our souls, nor do we strain our spirits, which marks our freedom and nobility. With such continued truth-telling rhetoric, the animals stack up evidence against human superiority, while human beings exude belligerent, bullying, inelegant language to try to justify the master-slave relationship between their species and that of other animals. By the time readers have read all but the final pages of the story, they may even wonder if the king of the jinn's judgment for the animals is prophetic of the Most High's judgment of human beings at the end of their lives. Again, this conclusion is controversial among scholars because while readers are led to believe by the narrative discourse that the animals will win their rights, a kind of deus ex machina in the form of a wise and wondrous human being pops up as an element of story, reversing the anticipated outcome. For the first time in the narrative discourse, a wise human being finally stands up and speaks wisely. The fact that human beings can reach godly perfection is announced to the assembly. For the moment, the king and entire court are left speechless and silence pervades. When asked for proof that such a person exists, the narrator describes this person as, quote, Persian by breeding, Arabian by faith, a Hanif by confession, Iraqi in culture, Hebrew in lore, Christian in manner, Damascene in devotion, Greek in science, Indian in discernment, Sufi in intimations, regal in character, masterful and thoughtful, and divine in awareness. The saintly interlocutor continues to speak peacefully and reverently in his appraisal of the capacities of human beings to approach God, purified and perfected on the way toward union. Here goes his speech. Praise be God, Lord of all the worlds, he said, destiny of the faithful and foe to none but the unjust. God bless the sealed prophets, foremost of God's messengers, Muhammad, God's elect, and all his worthy house and good nation. These saints of God are the flower of creation, the best, the purest persons of fair and praiseworthy parts, pious deeds, myriad sciences, godly awareness, regal character, just and holy lives and awesome ways. Fluent tongues weary to name their qualities, and no one has adequately described their inner core. Many have cited their virtues, and preachers in public assemblies have devoted their lives down through the ages to sermons dilating on their merits and their godly ways without ever reaching the pith of the matter. All listen awestruck as they gaze in mystery described in the form of a saint and remember God as their destination, God who's the destiny of the faithful and foe to none but the unjust. The human participants at court become aware of the time they have wasted in attempting to establish superior status and lord it over creatures. Will they then be ranked in the files of the just or unjust, and thus a friend or foe of God? But it is not all up to them, the brethren insist at the very end, for he, God, has the power to effect what he will. And the brethren are there to assist all participants on a grace-filled journey, leaving them with this example of intercessory prayer and blessing to encourage them all on the way. We have now laid out our story of 51 epistles as clearly and concisely as possible, and this essay is one of them. God grant you success, dear brothers, in reading and grasping it fully. May he open your hearts, lay wide your breasts, and enlighten your eyes with the inner meaning of these words, and smooth the way for you to put these thoughts into practice, as he has done with pure, holy, and devoted saints. For he has the power to effect what he will. Finally, all creation waits in suspension for an answer to whether human beings can live out their capacity for becoming a full human being under God in kinship with other creatures, living devoted and pure lives. The verdict is left to the reader to listen to the brethren's authorial directive to put thoughts into practices, to lay wide breaths with contrite hearts, to reassess their lives, and once more to tread the path in obedience to God and in kinship with all creatures. To exercise examples of the cross-pollination of ideas in more depth, the Brethren's Book of the Creatures of Epistle 22, as we have seen, gives animal voices that they may hope for justice. We hear their complaints in no uncertain terms and also reflect perhaps on our own arrogant agreement to the argument that, of course, we are superior to other animals. However, we also learn that sense of superiority over other creatures may not be defined by God as a justification for abuse. Thus, in our examination of two texts about embarking on a mystical journey to return to the source of all in prayer, we find that the Brethren's fable gives voices to creatures as part of this journey. But Bonaventure does not in his writings, choosing instead the genre of a mystical treatise instead of a fable to serve his purposes. For the Brethren, justice and mercy to creatures seem to be needed for human beings to perfect themselves on their return to the source. Bonaventure does not explicitly argue this point on the mind's road, but he elevates individual creatures as sacraments, visible signs of God's invisible grace, and thus as ways to encounter God in prayer. How could a human being abuse a visible sign of God's invisible grace? The Jenny sage's observation that opens the courtroom scene, their comments about the diversity of creatures that the Jinn counselor and the king view before them, comes close to viewing creatures as vehicles of God's grace and sacramental encounter, but not in the Christian sense of sacrament, which traditionally interpreted is a conduit of God's grace in and through Jesus Christ. I'm going to run out of time.
1 more minute.
Okay, well, I'll go to the conclusion very quickly. Jews, Muslims, Christians, Sufis, and Franciscans and others enjoy opportunities to practice their capacity for loving friendship with one another, to establish themselves in communities as compassionate, like-minded souls, to employ their energies in saving the environment and achieving peace in a strife-filled world. And I go on to talk about saints, the saints emerging among us and the hope for saints. And I point to Greta Thunberg, the 20-year-old who's traveling the world, looking at the devastation right now of global warming as perhaps a saint for our times. And we don't know her religiosity. We don't know if she affirms one faith or another, but we know that she is a catalyst for change. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I had a whole lot more to read, but I didn't have time for it. Thank you.
Thank you. This was most interesting. Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth. Now I turn to the second presentation by Dr. Saundra Sterling Epstein of Bay Yachat in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I hope I pronounced everything correctly, Saundra. Please go ahead. Share your screen.
You did. You're great. Okay, here we go. All right, everybody can see that, right? All right, so I'm always interested in the cumulative effect of these conference experiences, how we talk about things, and by the time you get to the end, and nobody can script this better. I see that one of our organizers is with us, and it just happens. It just always happens, and it's amazing. So I'm covering the topic of environmental sustainability, Jewish mystical teachings, and practicality. And one of the things that's really important to understand and to, I just want to do one thing here, there you go, and to remember is that when we talk about this within a Jewish context, I'm going to be using actual texts from our Holy Writ. I'm also going to be using thinkers through the ages, and we begin back in the very beginning with Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 1 and 2 in Genesis tell two different stories of creation. The first chapter is basically setting everything in place, and the second chapter is about relationality of everything. Within this piece of relationality, we read chapters 2, verses 7 and 15, and God breathed into the nose of the earthling, proper best translation of Adam. It is not a gendered term, by the way. the breath of life, and the earthling became a nefesh chaya, a living being, a being with a soul. And the Lord God took the earthling and put the earthling into the Garden of Eden to work it and guard its land and its resources. In other words, we are stewards. We are not owners. We are not the ones that, why is this not moving? Why is this not moving? There you go. We are, that went too fast. We are not the owners. We are not the ones who get to determine how the earth is to be used. The earth does not serve us. We serve it. Back in chapter 1, we read, God says, let the earth bring forth every living creature, that every beast comes after its kind. God makes the earthling in our image, speaking to the angels or to all of creation, depending on your commentaries that you want to use. And let these human beings have dominion over all the things that have been created. God created the earthling in God's image. In the image of God, male and female were created. And God blessed them. God said to them, be fruitful, be multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it. Take care of it. And God said, behold, I have given you every herb yielding seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. It shall be food for you. There's an organization called Jewish Vegetarians of America. They tend to be observant Jews, and their comment is, we were originally intended to be vegetarians, as is given here. And it was so. God saw everything that God made, and behold, it was very good. Now, when you look at this, you have these 6 periods of creation. I am not taking them as days. I'm taking them as periods of time. And in those periods, we are noting that, there you go. No, went one too far. Okay. In those periods, we are noting that we're not talking about 24 hours. I'm going by Gerald Schroeder, who teaches that each period of time is an unspecified period of time. It can be billions of years, it can be hundreds of thousands of years, whatever it is. But during the 6th period of time, the animals are created. God says, okay, everything is good. Then the human being is created. God says, very good. The human being is the last one that is created. What does that mean? Does that mean that for our purposes, everything is created? Or does it mean that we are the last ones created? Humility. So one could look at it either way. Either everything was set in the palace for us to take over, or is it that we were the last ones that were created to teach us humility? Rabbi Gershon Winkler, a contemporary student and teacher of Kabbalah, explains, in the creation myth of ancient Jewish mysticism, God creates the universe by a process dubbed tzimtzum. And many of us have heard this term at different points during this conference, which in Hebrew means a sort of stepping back to allow for there to be another, an else, as in something or someone else. In other words, if God took up all the space, then how can there be space for us? Think of a container of water, and you put something in the water, and that is going to take up space in the container. The Judaic notion of a world of free will is deeply rooted in this concept, as is in creating life, the Ein Sof, the endless one, the infinite one, subdued the omnipotent, all-embracing divine presence for the sake of the realization of the divine will that should be other beings. In other words, God contracted and contained and held God's self at bay in order that there be room for all that God created, a place to err, to fall, to believe, to doubt, to cry, to laugh. And that's a really interesting teaching. Again, there's this notion in Jewish teachings in a lot of places that we learn humility from God. Everything we learn from God. So Maimonides in the Middle Ages, in Hilchot Deah, the laws of knowledge, teaches as follows. The foundation of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom is to know that there is only one primary being who brought all other being into existence. All the beings of the heavens, the earth, and what is between them came into existence only from that being. God brought it all together, this greater being. So everything is part of it. And when we go through the various aspects of our creation, we're trying to touch back to the divine, as many of the people who are in this Zoom room right now have already taught, from the animals of Shintoism to the issue of hubris to the teachings of Rumi and so much else. Maimonides continues, if one would imagine that this being does not exist, then no other being could possibly exist. There has to be God, and that is different from Aristotle's first cause, just parenthetically saying, because God is involved. If one would imagine that none of the entities aside from that being existed, this being alone would continue to exist, and the nullification of the existence of everything else would never nullify the primary being's existence, because all other entities require that being. That being, on the other hand, does not require them in order to exist. So what we're saying here is that, here we go, is that God exists, this being. When we talk about mysticism, we're talking about trying to sort of get out of our reality to get to God, and or the reaching within or reaching without. And the idea is that in Jewish teaching and Jewish mysticism, nature, every aspect of nature, plants, seeds, animals, everything is part of God's creation. Everything is blessed by God, and therefore we should bless everything. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But I want to now go to Rabbi Nachman, who from Breslov, who is a Hasidic master, a mystic, who had a prayer for nature. And many of our mystics, many of our Kabbalists would live in nature or would go out and commune with nature. So we begin. Rabbi Nachman would go out for a talk in the field, which is taken to be, by the way, prayer. And this comes to us from when Isaac in the Torah goes out to speak with God in the field. That is in Brachot 35a in the Talmud. And the idea till today, many synagogues, many davening, many prayer spaces are created and are made in a way that nature is all around. Even the east side, when you're facing east, that there will be windows so that people can look outside. Here are the words that Rabbi Nachman left for all of us when we consider nature in our lives. Grant me the ability to be alone. May it be my custom to go outdoors every morning amongst the trees and the grass, among all growing things, and there may I be alone, and enter into prayer, to talk with the one to whom I belong. May I express there everything in my heart, and may all the foliage of the field, the grasses, the trees, the plants, all those things that were talked about in the creation of the world, awake at my coming, to send the powers of their life into the words of my prayer, so that my prayer and speech are made whole through the life and spirit of all growing things, which are made as one by their transcendent source. May I then pour out the words of my heart before your presence like water, O God, and lift up my hands to you in worship on my behalf and that of my children. So there's this respect for nature. There's this concept called Bal Tashchit, that we don't waste anything, that we try to make sure that everything that we have is used. It's not dissimilar to the Native Americans who, when they would kill an animal, everything was used, whether it was for clothing or for shelter or for food. We are not to waste. That is a very strong principle in Jewish thinking. Also, in Jewish mysticism, our interaction with God is done through very practical and scripted aspects of our daily life. We have this thing called a bracha, a blessing. We say a blessing for everything before we smell fragrant flowers, before we eat anything, before we put on new clothes, whatever it is. We're supposed to acknowledge that everything we have comes from God. God made enough space, not just for us, but that everything else that we would need or that we need to watch over. And therefore, one of the first things we do for children is we teach them how to bless everything. In fact, we're taught that if you eat something or enjoy something without saying the proper blessing, it's as if you're stealing. So the Mishnah teaches us, how does one recite a blessing over fruits? Over fruits that grow on a tree, one recites who creates the fruit of the tree, with the exception of wine. Over wine, one recites who creates the fruit of the vine. Over fruits that grow from the earth, one says the fruit of the ground, with the exception of bread, who has its own blessing. And it goes on, and we say these blessings that are very specific to the item to indicate that we understand where those items fit in creation and how God put them there for us. humility. Not everything is mine and I can take it, but I acknowledge that were it not for God, were it not for the divine, I would have nothing. From where are these matters the obligation of blessings derived, as the sages taught, that we sanctify everything for praises before God. This is where Rabbi Akiva said, a person is forbidden to taste anything before he recites a blessing. As with that reciting praise over food, it has the status of what's called hekdesh. It's a consecrated item. It's something that belongs to God, and we have no right to take it. That's where the idea of we are stealing something comes from. So this idea leads to a notion of respect for all that is in creation. And this is something that we find in the Kabbalah, as well as the Talmud, both our mystical texts and our, what we would call general religious practice texts as well. So in Baba Metzia, another Talmudic piece, we read about the animals. And I love that Elizabeth, if you look at the end of Elizabeth's abstract, if you start to read, while we seek to know the unknowable God, I note that that last section as it's written fits right in to where this particular piece goes and where this session goes. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's suffering came upon him due to an incident. What was the incident that led to his suffering? The Gemara answers that there was a certain calf that was being led to slaughter. The calf went and hung its head on the corner of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's garment and was weeping. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said to it, "Go, for you were created for this purpose," in other words, to be slaughtered. As it was said in heaven, since he was not compassionate toward the calf, let afflictions come upon him. And we're taught that if an animal is to be slaughtered but nuzzles up to you and sort of becomes domesticated by a relationship with you, then that animal is not to be slaughtered. One day, the maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was sweeping his house. There were young weasels lying about, and she was in the process of sweeping them. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said, "Let them be. As it's written, the Lord's mercies are over all his works." And they said in heaven, since he was compassionate, we will be compassionate on him, and he was relieved of his suffering. Now, the problem is that this is not quite so simple because, and this is what the observant Jewish mystic vegetarian has to deal with. On one hand, God put everything here for a purpose, and we already eat meat and it's protein and all of that. But this is obviously before veggie meat came into our lives. But the fact of the matter is we also have to show this compassion. So there's a balance here. So in engaging in this elevation of our actions through blessing, through understanding the animals, through having compassion, we come closer to the ideal unity that the Kabbalists would have us strive for. They explain that there are 4 levels in our creation process and within our living as part of the system that combines human and divinity. And these are Asiya, action, Yetzirah, formation, Briah, creation, and Atzilut, emanation of pure godliness. What's interesting is the human being, in their attempt to reach the divine, goes in the order of from action to formation of idea, to creation, understanding creation. Through my action, I understand something was formed. Through something being formed, I understand it was created. I understand it was only created by the emanation of God. God comes the other way, Atzilut. God emanates, God's godliness. God then uses that potential to create. That creation then becomes formed, and then it leads to action. And where we meet is a participatory journey, a participatory and a shared trajectory that we go on and God goes on, and we meet in the middle. So how do we take all of this and incorporate it in our lives? A contemporary teacher, Rav Soloveitchik, an important Orthodox rabbi who died some years ago, and also, again, had a Kabbalistic knowledge. And in Judaism, you find, in the Jewish mystic community, you find these are rabbis, these are Kabbalists, these are mathematicians, these are physicians, these are physicists, they're everything. And the mysticism here is pulling everything together into the whole. And Rav Soloveitchik teaches, holiness does not wink at us from beyond, but appears in our actual, very real lives. The beginnings of holiness are rooted in the highest heavens, and its end is embedded in the end of days. But the link that joins together is this halachic concept of separateness, of sanctity, the holiness of the concrete. An individual does not become sanctified through mystical adhesion to the absolute, nor through mysterious union with the infinite, but rather through his whole biological life, actualizing the halakha, the Jewish law, in the empirical world. Holiness is created by man, by humans, by people, by earthling, by flesh and blood. Through the power of our mouths, through verbal sanctification alone, we can create holy offerings. We can relate to God. So what Rav Soloveitchik is teaching here, and I will end with one more thought, if the frame goes, which it should, is that this is all done through daily actions. We do not have to look outside. We do not have to look beyond. If we want to attain that oneness with God, we have a system of daily life and actions that enable that unity. There's this concept, and I'm surprised I haven't heard of it yet in our time together, but I know I've heard of it in other places, but I'm going to use it from the work of David Seidenberg, eco-theology. And this is explained in David Seidenberg's book, Kabbalah and Ecology, God's Image in the More Than Human World. As study of Kabbalah and environment has continued through the years, David Seidenberg, a contemporary scholar, explains thoroughly that this unity is exemplified in eco-theology, the notion that this ultimate unity from which we all come and seek as a goal includes all aspects of all that is created, to the point that how we interact with inanimate objects is as critical in Jewish mysticism as our connections to other human beings. In other words, how we react to plants, to animals, to all factors of our environment. We say a blessing when we see a rainbow. Everything is part of our life and part of the mystery of the divine, and an opportunity to connect for those of us that were in the session on arts. Any of this can be expressed in the arts, and it connects us to God. The notion was expressed in an earlier session that everything begins with God and everything goes back to God, and that is clearly the case here. This is just as important as our connections to other human beings in Jewish mysticism. We worry about our animals, we worry about our plants, we treat them properly. Simply, all is part of creation and subject to the directives of the Creator God, to whom we are all accountable. Often the topic of hubris has come up as a deterrent in terms of reaching any kind of mystical union with God or aspiring to something greater in our lives. And within Judaism, we have a system of actions, asiyah. We aspire to God, and we do it through all elements of our being, reminding us that we are humble, that we are only the stewards of all that God created, not the owners.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Saundra Sterling Epstein, on that excellent presentation on Jewish mystical teachings and environmental sustainability. Now we will move to our third and last presentation by Dr. Etin Anwar of the Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. Her talk is titled Embracing Unity, the Making of Ecological Self and Its Mystical Foundations. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Good evening. I hope everyone is going to be able to retain for another 20 minutes, given I am the last one to speak. I'm going to share my PowerPoint presentation. At the same time, I would like to give some hints. I keep the title, I keep some content of the abstract, but I change the direction of the paper of the talk, because this is still a very early process in my work on ecological self. All right. Slow. Are you able to see? Thank you. As I said earlier, I keep the title Embracing Unity, Ecological Self and Its Mystical Foundation. I change a little bit for the abstract, but I'm going to essentially show what it is about in the table of content, as well as the sub-theme that I have put on this PowerPoint presentation. I'm trying to make the argument on the importance of the constitution of ecological self and how to find the mystical foundation for it. I try to look at the ecological self as sites for human kinship and for climate justice awareness. So that's what I'm trying to go. And when I change the thesis, of course, the rest of the abstract doesn't go well. So I have to switch into where I'm going to be. I said earlier about my thesis, I'm going to give some background. I try to put the ecological self in context, and then I'll go over one by one. I'm looking at the three constituents of ecological self: self-knowledge, self-yearning, and self-moderation. I would like to try to contextualize my research in terms of environmental studies as well as ecology, and try to look for the importance of ecological self. There are three sides that I would like to discuss here. First, the root of environmental crisis. Many authors in Islam have already pointed out the root for ecological crisis, but I look at here one of them, Abdul Mateen. His book Green Dean is very inspiring, and he identifies some of these ideas and practices that shape the way the world now. From the Islamic perspective, it has to do with the misuse of trust. Human beings are given the trust to become the Khalifa of the earth, God's representative. Unfortunately, Muslims do not live up into this expectation. As you all probably know, overconsumption, capitalism, the use of fossil fuels, colonial abuses, and the mismanagement of sources from the colonized world, as well as unjust economic relations, war between capitalism, socialism, all of this become the root for environmental crisis. When we are trying to look for the discipline itself and locate its ecological self, I use Gade, Muslim environmentalism. She discusses the transition from environmental studies with the emphasis on nature, and we also see world religions cohere on conservation. They reduce into the concept. Particular talks about self-alienation, from the sacred, from God, from the Quran, and we are looking at also the transition. Ecology to be a scientific and there is actually a book. It says ecological science, and it proves how ecology is scientific. For Muslims, if they want to try to find the contribution to environmental problem, climate change, they need to start from environmental. My work falls into environmental humanity. Ecology in Islam is to look at environmental humanities. Another context that I would like to propose is solution to ecological self, to ecological crisis, ecological problems. First, we need to look at, according to Jayusi, spiritual healing. As you all probably know, Nasser, in his speech in 1960s, he talks about the alienation. Modernism creates alienation, human alienation, self-alienation from the sacred. And one solution for it is to, among other solutions, is to apply spiritual healing or to return to spirituality. We are also looking at this according to Jayusi. We are trying to frame Islam as a worldview and a way of life to look at the crisis. And we are also, this is in Nasser's book, we need to address the destruction of the harmony between God and nature, try to bring human and nature as one unit instead of separating them. And Nasser suggests for us to be at peace with God and his creations. And this is the direction where I'm going, where I talk about ecological self. I'm going to move on into self-knowledge. How do we become one in humanity? How do we become one in human kinship? This is the part where I use Abrahamic model. I thought Abraham is a common departure for Christians, Muslims, and we can learn from each other on the basis of Abraham. According to Ibn Arabi, Abraham is seen as God friend. Ibn Arabi here reiterates what the Quran says. The Quran says that Abraham is Khalilullah, God friend. And in the process of explaining Abraham as God's friend, Ibn Arabi makes the argument that God creates everything and everything is his essence. So there is no duality between God and humans, between God and nature. Everything is one because God created everything and he is part of that thing. Everything which comes out of him is his essence. So human beings are God's essence. And I think I heard from Saundra. Saundra was talking about God creates everything in human image. God creates humanity in his image. So it is clear we can go back and forth to look at Islam and Judaism and even Christianity, especially when we read the creation stories in all traditions. Because God permeates in everything, everything has part of God, humans and nature become sacred. For this reason, Nasser, for instance, asked us to go back to consider the sacredness of nature, the sacredness of human being. To a certain degree, in my opinion, there is an attempt to preserve human dignity as sacred, although not all the time, given, we have the history of slavery and many others. But there is a strong emphasis in Islam that human dignity is invaluable. Abraham, as the manifestation of God, he comes to understand about his own identity. God reveals himself, God discloses himself, and this kind of disclosure shapes Abraham's fixed identity. I'm trying to look for a modern understanding of fixed identity. I think it has to do with Abraham existent, existentialism. So Abraham existent is partly godly or divine. According to this argument, Abraham encompasses all God's attributes. Because God's attributes manifest in Abraham, Abraham carries within himself God's attribute. According to Ibn Arabi, it says the real himself is the very indication of himself and his divinity, that the cosmos is nothing but his self-disclosure. So God reveals himself in human, in cosmos, in macrocosm, and in macrocosmos and microcosm. With that in mind, there are differences in terms of the degree how one could maintain God's self-disclosure in us, and because it is appropriated according to our readiness, according to our source, according to Ibn Sina later on. Abraham comes to know God in terms of self-knowledge, that he is God's friend. What does it mean? Abraham and God is one unit. Of course, Ibn Arabi is very well known with the doctrine of Wahdatul Wujud. Some of you probably heard already from some presentations today. But here, Abraham comes to understand his existence, and a lot of time, the existence of God in us is veiled. And Sufism is going to be very helpful in unveiling, at least in Al-Ghazali's language. God would help to unveil himself within us. And later on, I'll show how unveiling is going to be important. What does it mean? yes, God and humans are one unit. However, it doesn't make us God, and it doesn't make God humans. Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi give the example of food. When we eat food, the food becomes part of us, but we are not become food. we are not becoming food, right? Although I was laughing because sometimes we would say, "Oh, you are potato head," you know, because because we are eating too much potato. But essentially, no, we don't become potatoes because we like potatoes. We don't become pizza because we like pizza. The point here is that God is embodied within us. However, God disappears, Anwar appears. That's the idea of self-knowledge as God's friend in Ibn Arabi's mind. I really like actually the example of how the example of food could be understood to understand God's existence in us. Yet at the same time, it remains us. Now, I'm going to connect this into humans' yearn for God. The reason why I switch into this rhetoric, because if God imparts Himself, if God discloses Himself to us, then what makes us? And how do we go back to God? And the only way for us to go back to God is to borrow Ibn Sina's theory of love. Abraham teaches us that we have self-knowledge about God. God is part of us. However, in the story of Abraham, at least in Fusus al-Hikam, we are not told in terms of going back to God. Yes, there are places where God gave Abraham the dream about Isaac, for instance, to be killed. There was interpretation about it. But anyway, Ibn Sina gives us, in my opinion, a very easy way to understand the need to go back to God. So God permits in everything, in human being, in us, in humanity, in human relationship. At the same time, according to Ibn Arabi, humans yearn to go back to God. Humans yearn to return to God. As a human humans yearn to return to God, God Himself. Please excuse me. I'm gonna grab my water. 1 minute. Sorry about that. God describes Himself as most longing to meet humans. Of course, in Ibn Arabi, there is a specific way to reach to God. But I want to explain the mechanic of going back to God using Ibn Sina because I think it's much easier to make that relationship. And also the emphasis is really humans yearn to God, and Ibn Sina writes Risalatul Ishq. According to Ibn Sina, all beings yearn toward the perfection, and this yearning for perfection is innate. However, this innate capacity is measured according to our state, according to our preparedness. Nothing is given, right? You have to put effort, and then God at the same time would invite you, would call you to be on His path. And according to Ibn Sina, the best love is the spiritual love to God. So now we are going to be introduced into different possibilities of perfection within us. And Ibn Sina makes it very, very clear that if we go back to God and be united with God, we would reach the notion of ittihad, unification. And I think some of you have already mentioned about fana, right? Annihilation of the self. But here Ibn Sina suggests to us that we could unite with God. And that kind of approach is possible because if we are using the Abrahamic model that we are already the container for the blessing from God, because God permeates in us, then it is easier to be united with God. Again, this is an imaginary understanding that we could be united with God, because in reality, Anwar exists as Anwar, although I could claim internally that I am united with God. To understand the unity between humans and God, we can look at how Ibn Sina's theory of the soul would help us. Ibn Sina, like Aristotle, categorizes 3 types of soul: rational soul, animal soul, and vegetative soul. Each function according to its capacity. But vegetative soul helps us grow. Animal souls help us with our impulses, with senses. At the same time, our rational soul is able to control our soul, and at the same time, our animal soul is able to give us some imagination, give us appetite, anger, and many other human responses in our daily life. However, Ibn Sina put emphasis on theoretical intellect and active intellect. Again, we have to bring the idea of God's permittability in us, God's present in us. So active intellect is useful here, because then Ibn Sina justifies why prophecy is important, because human beings are the container for prophetic mission.
1 more minute, Etin.
Yes, love as the drive for perfection. All of these have its own perfection. Animal for food, animal vegetative soul for food, animal rational soul for sexual intercourse, warfare, rational soul for assimilation with God. Very quickly, I want to show why moderation is important. On the one hand, we have the souls that correspond to whatever mental state we have. On the other hand, we have the capacity to love God, to imitate God. However, our imitation of God could bring either peace or disaster. And the disaster part is the part where we need to be concerned, because it could be racial injustice, it could be a disaster, natural disasters like COVID and many others. I'm gonna just go to the conclusion here. I'm expanding the idea from Abraham that we all have self-knowledge of God, and God is known in us, in our existence. We also embody God attribute. Because we embody God attribute, we have to project God attribute into other human being, into nature. And this is the place where I emphasize on how ecologically oriented self could function as a site for human flourishing, for human kinship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anwar. This was excellent. So applauding everyone's presentations here. So if we have any questions, I would request that all of us put our questions in the chat, or somehow raise your hand so I can call upon you. Any questions in the chat? Or raising your hands? Nancy, do you have any questions?
I have a lot of questions for Dr. Anwar. I don't know where to start. I guess I would like to hear a little bit more about the significance of moderation specifically in what you've laid out.
Would you like me to answer that question? Right. So the Muslim world I know is very enchanted with the idea of moderation. Many Muslim countries are battling with Islamic radicalism, so that they try to introduce and reintroduce moderation as a framework, as an ethical framework. Originally, it was part of the Quran, where the Quran talks about Muslims to become witness to themselves as ummatan wasatoh, the moderate community. And this call for a moderate community comes during the time when the Prophet Muhammad attempted to introduce the direction of the prayer. Muslims attempted to be included by the Jews in Medina. However, after some time, politically, the Jews were part of the Medina state, but at the same time, there were some political problems, not with the Jews. The Jews were signatories to the Medina Constitution, at least the way Muslims would put it. So some of you may have different account. And for some time, Muslims prayed toward the direction of Jerusalem, and then the Prophet Muhammad received this revelation. And the beginning of this revelation says that I'm gonna just read the Quranic verse, so that we are on the same page, because it says, "Thus we have made of you an ummah justly balanced, that yet ye might be witnesses over the nations, and the messengers as witnesses over yourself." So the Quran was asking Muslim to witness and become witness. The implication is that Muslims ought to embody the moderate paradigm in daily life. Kamali has written a book, Moderation in Islam, and he explains about the term, what does moderation mean, and it refers usually to justice. Moderation and justice go hand in hand, essentially. To be a moderate person is to enact justice, or to act justly. Nowadays, in my work, I try to look at self-moderation as, this is almost like the final layer in human agency, because you could have Tawheed. I think many of you have mentioned about Tawheed as the basis for our faith. But then at the same time, how do we enact our Tawheed? The enactment of Tawheed could be as harsh as my apology, I'm going to put name here, Wahhabism, right? That's also on the basis of Tawheed. But Tawheed could be as moderate as I have. So it could be different from one person to others, from one community to other, among Muslims themselves, in utilizing the concept Tawheed. But it is very, very clear that moderation could function in every layer. When we embrace Tawheed, it has to be inclusive of others. When we embrace the pillars of Islam, it has to be inclusive of others. Muslims cannot be exclusive in enacting Islam, because the moderation demands a balanced lifestyle in every way. I hope that answers.
Thank you, Etin, for the answer, and thank you, Nancy, for the question. I will exercise my privilege. Okay, Elizabeth, do you want to go next? You have a question?
Yes, I wanted to ask Anwar, I wanted to ask her about the word Khalifa and how the Quran sees that and how we translate it. Dr. Mahmoud Ayub was one of my professors at Temple University, and he translated it as co-gerund. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, is that a good translation? Would you concur with that, or not? And just for a little discussion there.
Right. Thank you, Elizabeth. It's interesting because usually it is also translated a vicegerund, but vicegerund relative to God, right? So God, and then human being as vicegerunds, yes. But I have some reservations in debating the term caliphate itself, Khalifa, because this term Khalifa has been gendered. Even the author that I'm reading, Ibn Arabi, that's the reason why I stopped, trying to put the gender spin into Ibn Arabi, because in Ibn Arabi, it is very clear that when Ibn Arabi talks about God permissibility, refers to, of course, man, right? And the example how God is embodied God share His image in Adam, but Adam gives his image to Eve. So now I began reading in terms of hierarchy, God and Adam, and then Adam and Eve, and that is the narrative, not the narrative in Islam. When I read Ibn Sina for this work, for this presentation, Risala fil Ishq, Ibn Sina also talks about how women are essentially matter. And by saying women are matter in philosophy, form and matter, men are form and women are matter. So now it takes back into how am I going to talk about ecological self when I'm basing my discussion on a gendered bias idea of God representative of self disclosure and many others. I haven't even touched that part yet. I'm just right now playing with all the terms to fit into ecological self in Islam. But everywhere I turn right now, I would go into the wall of this masculine understanding of the terms. Not only understanding masculine norm of the term. Love is understood in terms of man. Khalifa is understood in terms of man. So there are, in my opinion, a lot of homework, even for myself. That is why if you feel everything is rough, because I'm just in the beginning of the journey. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Anwar.
Thank
Now,
you.
Jason, then Saida, and then I will ask a question. Jason, you are next.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to go back to Elizabeth's paper, if I may, and I'll start with a general comment and then move to the question, because from an interreligious perspective, this fable of the Ikhwān Ṣafā takes on a new life with a late medieval Franciscan friar, Anselm Turmeda, who takes the same story and reframes it in the Catalan language. It's called The Debate Between the Friar Anselm Turmeda and the Ass. And the funny thing, I'm sorry about the closed captioning, the donkey. And the fascinating thing he does with it is that he strips out the diversity of the different voices of the animals, and he makes the ass the spokesperson for all of the animals. And in the end, he, the human being, wins the debate, but everyone knows that the ass really won the debate. The human wins this Pyrrhic victory at the end. It's a fascinating fable, made even more fascinating by the fact that this friar later converts to Islam and ends up writing a scathing anti-Christian polemic in Arabic after his conversion. One of the fascinating stories of Franciscan connections with Muslims in history. My question comes back to Saint Bonaventure, and is basically this: how do you understand the anthropomorphism in Bonaventure? You know, in Bonaventure, the human being serves as a microcosm for the macrocosm. The human being has this exalted vocation in the divine plan that does not precisely track with Islamic reflections on the role of being Khalifatullah, the vicegerent of God. Your paper ended on this notion of literary genres. The difference between Bonaventure's and type of style of analysis and the genre genre of a literary fable. But aside from that difficulty, you know, because Bonaventure was sort of shortchanged in the presentation due to time.
Right.
Could you please make a comment on the centrality of the human person in Bonaventure vis-a-vis Ikhwān Ṣafā?
Well, both Bonaventure and Ṣafā are focusing on people who are sitting right there before them, and that's their students. And you know, it's probably in both cases male audiences. And I feel that in a way, you know, it's almost it's just a woeful thing, but it just feels like sexism and male-centered universes are part and parcel of all the mystical treatises and different stories that I have read, except those from women. I mean, you'll see Julian of Norwich, for example, and you'll see Hildegard von Bingen. You'll approach God as mother, or as there'll be such a way that there's not projection of the image of God, the Imago Dei, as being a male image that a female carries around with her, you know. So it is frankly, if you want to know the truth, I'm just starting working with him for the past couple of years. And I have, even though I have a women's studies certification, I have not allowed his obvious male or human-centered universe. You know, I guess that's what you're thinking when you're talking about the human-centered universe. I have not.
I mean human-centered, not male-centered. Although for him it was male-centered also, but human-centered is the issue.
I've been trying to turn that upside down, and that's why, you know, I didn't get to read the rest of that text to you, because my idea is that rather there being a hierarchical structure where you move from the book of the creatures and then you move to the book of the soul, and Christ is sitting on the seat of judgment and mercy at the end, and there's union. I mean, that's a very sad, you know, a shortcut that I'm just a descriptive way of talking about the books 3 through 7. But instead of that, my arguments in the paper is going to be that the book of the creatures is foundational to the rest of the journey. In other words, it's not moving from matter to spirit. Let me read this passage to you, just so that, because this is what I left out, and it's short. So, from all that has been said above, this is in chapters 1 and 2, we may conclude that from the creation of the world, the invisible things of God are seen, being understood through those things that are made, so that they are without excuse. We do not wish to pay attention to these things, or to know, bless, and love God in all things, since such people do not wish to be lifted to God from darkness into the marvelous light of God. But thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord has lifted us out of darkness into this marvelous light, since because of the lights that come to us from outside, we might be disposed to re-enter the mirror of our mind, to which divine reality shines forth. And I think that the fact that he put most of his efforts into writing the first 2 books, because the rest of the treatise is short compared to that emphasis at the beginning, that, you know, I think he's remembering St. Francis and the Canticle of the Sun, and all the legacies of the Franciscan tradition that sees Francis as the lover of creation, and that's such a strong element in his mind. Now, he's shortly after writing this, he's going to put together the second life of St. Francis. It supposedly cancels out Thomas of Solano's life, in which it didn't, thank heavens, because I like his life better. But anyway, and so I think there's a tension there. And I think that tension comes from, he wants to be intimately connected to the founder, especially now that he's been made Minister General just recently of the entire order. And he's going to be leading 30,000 friars, many of them still alive, who remembered St. Francis and his love of creation and how he would move worms out of the way on the road so you shouldn't step on them, and all the things he did day in and day out, loving creation and loving other creatures. So he wants to honor that. But on the other hand, he's speaking to these friars, these preachers, these people who are going to be, dealing with confessionals, how, they're going to be explaining scriptures. There's so much to try to teach these students of his at the University of Paris on what it means to be a Christian. So how is he he can't just stay with even though the emphasis in St. Francis' life, I might argue, who loved Jesus very much too, but the emphasis is very much understood to be on God, the Most High, the creator of the universe and creation. So how's he going to balance, that foundational understanding of Francis with his very, I would say, astute understanding of the interior life of the Trinity? Because God emanates all being and goodness, the fons plenitude, I think he called it, and through the entire universe. So all the universe is good and reflects God's being. And then there's the interior life. That same emanation goes on in the interior life, in the sense that, God's goodness and life and being and goodness are interchanged among the three persons of the Trinity. So there's a relational issue going on here, both inside the Trinity and also in the mercy and love and being that is spread out into the universe. So I think there's a tension there. Who am I? And how am I going to go about teaching and preparing these young men for working in the world, and also giving them a sense that they're founder, that they're there for a reason, to be able to, explain the gospel, go from gospel to life and from gospel to life and life to gospel in such a way that they can also represent their founder. So I've been kind of floundering with that, but my argument's going to be that his so-called hierarchical understanding and prayer of moving from matter to spirit for some people is really not a good way of looking at it, because I believe the matter or creation is the foundation of the road to God. Anyway, so maybe not. Maybe your answer is that maybe it's not,
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth.
centered. I don't know. I was just musing.
You were.
Okay.
So Dr. Saundra has a comment. When I speak about God, she writes, I avoid gendered terms at all cost. I figure we have enough issues in discussing God. Why add a linguistic problem? So any thoughts to that, Elizabeth or Etin?
Can I just qualify that very quickly?
Yes.
All right. So in Judaism, from the beginning, and I did this in the earlier session that I spoke in, from unity to discord to unity, the model is that the first human being was this two-sided human being that was then separated, and we spend our time trying to come back together. So Jewish mysticism specifically has really taken that on, and through the Zohar, through Sefer Yetzirah, through all these different texts, the masculine and the feminine are seen as complementary. They are not seen as so much as controlling one above the other. In fact, the example that I used in that comment was that when God appears on the earth, we call it the Shekhinah, which is the feminine quality of God. When we say what you would say, the God Lord, Hashem Elohim. So one aspect is feminine, one aspect is masculine. This has all kinds of ramifications. There are 12 different gendered terms in the Torah and in rabbinic literature. It's not dichotomous. It's not the same as it is in a lot of Christian thinking. So when I say that Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism does not have to operate outside of the Jewish framework of how one learns and lives and prays and all of that, it's because there are certain elements in the system that already lend itself to that kind of understanding. So I wasn't saying it as a critique. I was just saying that I assume that there's more energy here around Christianity and Islam. I just wanted to make the point that in Jewish mysticism, it's not as much of an issue. That's all. Sorry.
Saida, please ask your question.
I just wanted to add that gender language of male-centeredness or human-centeredness ends up being political. I mean, it causes suffering. So language is very important for us to always consider. That's it.
So we have 5 minutes left. Saida, just 1 minute for your question, and then whoever answers.
I really, my question has disappeared among all the discussion, but I just, first, Etin, Ibn Arabi is something we have to go every day. In the story of Adam and Eve, I do not see any hierarchy at all, but I'll come to that later because I've gone into that because I wrote on the feminine. Okay, and Saundra's Judaism and Islam is very much on similar terrain, but the key word in everything, which Etin did touch on, I wish, or maybe she did, I missed it. I wish she had expanded on that. Dr. Johnston wrote a huge thick book, Trusteeship in Christianity and Islam, and I asked him, you know, he used the word trusteeship from Islam, amana, and I kind of said, why didn't you use steward? Because Christian steward, to me, it speaks. I mean, it resonates with me. And he said, no, it does not resonate with him. It's strange how traditions blend when we are seekers. He said, in the word stewardship, he found a kind of dominance, and I couldn't quite see what he said, but then he saw it, and he's a priest. I mean, he's a pastor, so he found trusteeship better, the Islamic word better, the amana better, and so that was interesting. But the word that resonates, especially when it comes to scatology, and I'm so glad Etin studied Nasser so much, because Dr. Nasser told me that he started talking about environment in Islam in the 50s, and he started writing in the 60s, I think maybe the 50s too. And I've still not read it because he wrote so much, and there's so much to read. But the fact that environmentalism is so important, so integral to Islamic beliefs is something that he spoke of so early and so passionately, but he said nobody was listening to me, and now people are listening to me. So the word tajalli, which Etin you did address, actually encompasses emanation. That when we speak of emanation, oh my God, that's it. Everything is God's emanation. The tiniest, ugliest worm is God's emanation. So, you know, honor it all. And Khalifa, nobody really quite the meaning of Khalifa. Ibn Arabi really put it beautifully. Khalf, it's behind. It's behind. God is behind. It's like the God has put you, but it's like Vice Regent doesn't even cover the translation. You know, so much gets lost with translation. So if it's not, it may be there behind the human being, but when we talk of tajalli, that's even more encompassing. So, you know, I can go on and on. So I'm going to stop here just to address Etin's Adam and Eve. No, Etin, I'm sorry, I have to use the word no instead of saying, because I thought like you until I found how he explained it. He said Eve was taken out of Adam and she's whole. And it was actually, he raised the feminine, whereas Adam became always kind of incomplete, trying to get back. So it is a huge metaphor of the feminine being more complete and the feminine being compassionate. Ibn Arabi actually raises the feminine divinity, the Rahman and the Rahim and all that. If you talk about hierarchy, wow, the feminine has been absolutely celebrated in Ibn Arabi. So it took me years to get there, but inshallah. So that story I've been really pouring into it, and that was fantastic. I'm so sorry it took so much time. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for that point. I also resonate more with the idea of trusteeship, the word trusteeship rather than stewardship, which I think has a connotation of dominance over other creatures, human dominance over other creatures. This was an excellent panel. I learned so much. Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth. Thank you, Dr. Saundra, and thank you, Dr. Etin Anwar. Big hand to everyone. You have a evaluation form to fill out in the chat, and let us stay on this chat for the closing part of the conference. Thank you all. So this concludes our session.